918. We're headed down into the cellar where the doors just opened on its own. Give us a sign that you want to communicate with us.
Broadcasting from the darkest corners of the Pacific Northwest, this is Transcendence.
Now you will receive us. Do not ask for your poor or you're hungry. We do not want your tired and sick. It is your corrupt we claim. It is your evil that will be sought by us. With every breath, we shall hunt them down, 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 down.
The power of Christ compels you. The power of Christ compels you. The power of Christ compels you.
Out of my way. People have to be told.
You know I can't let you do that.
What are you guys?
Well, we've been called ghost hunters, paranormal researchers.
We prefer to be known simply as
Emma Strange and Charlieripley.
Good evening, Oregonians. I'm Emma Strange.
And I'm Charlieripley.
And tonight we're going to be covering the topic of Fairview Training Center here in Oregon. So let's go ahead and get right into it. For many of us, the history of mental health in this country and even beyond is something most would prefer to forget. It is ugly, it's painful, it's mortifying. And while we have met leaps and bounds in how we care for our fellow human beings, there's still a long way to go. Oregon's history concerning the care and treatment of the mentally ill and is no different than any other state here in America, as we well know. But for those of us who have resided in the Pacific Northwest, there's a stain in our history that the government prefers to gloss over as if it never happened at all. I know Charlie feels similarly, but I stand firm in my belief that while these atrocities should never have occurred, sweeping them under the rug does little in the way of empathy and education. We need to know our history. We need to own up to those mistakes, and we need examples of how we can be better and move forward to keep these kinds of human rights violations from ever happening again. And this is exactly why we're going to be covering Fairview tonight. Now, I understand that most of you are here for the paranormal aspects of the cases that Charlie and I cover, and while we will touch on those aspects towards the end of our research, the conversation in these next few episodes will dominate in the history and the people involved.
I mean, mental illness, as we go through this episode, we're going to be talking about things that have happened in the past, but it's still a problem to this day. Like, even me, born in the 90s, was partially raised to believe that there was no such thing as mental illness and that, it's just laziness or a lack of willpower. So that's why we can't ignore it, right? Because if we do, it'll just continue to be brushed under the rug. I know the conversations are opening up now, but conversations aren't necessarily enough.
No, and it's something, as you and I have both realized as we're hitting year 30 now, that with you, if you're comfortable talking about it, recently were diagnosed with anxiety disorder, generalized anxiety, correct?
Mine was something I developed because I was stressing myself out too much. I was working too hard, and then just one day it all kind of snapped, and I was embarrassed to talk about it because I have medical anxiety too, but I just, I thought like, oh, I'm dying and this is how it's going to be. But it all overflowed at one point because it was just like, I can't take this anymore. I also have physical problems. I have my hernia. I've endured a great amount of physical pain, but the pain of the anxiety was much worse, much more unbearable than living with a hernia for 15, 20 years.
Right. And as someone on my end of the spectrum who has severe social anxiety, I struggle with depression, I struggle with ADHD, I struggle with PTSD. It's really hard to deal with on a daily basis. And we were both born in the 90s. And so growing up as millennials and coming into this newfound mental health age where we're talking about it, we're normalizing things, it's been so beneficial for me to learn about my conditions as an adult because I wasn't diagnosed as a child. And that comes with its own set of struggles because there's things that you do and the ways that you think are normal or you feel isolated in because you're not brought up to talk about it. Nobody talks about it. From a familial standpoint, my mother's worked in social services, and when she was younger, she ran a daycare and worked with a lot of developmentally disabled children. And you'll hear in our interview with Debbie, which will be in our next episode, how we discuss how, when you're raising kids or you're in the school system, early on, we didn't intermingle kids with disabilities, whether they be physical or mental, with neurotypical students. It just didn't happen. It's starting to become more of a normalized thing now, which I'm very thankful for. And I'm thankful for the upbringing that I had, where I had the opportunity to grow up with kids who were different than me. And I feel like it made me more empathetic. It made me more understanding. And as I was telling Debbie in the interview, that it never struck me as something abnormal, because that's just how I grew up. And as I grew up, I learned that was not the norm.
Yeah. And even though, we're trying to do the socialization, kids are mean too, right? But if you normalize it from a young age, it's much different than trying to okay, now we're going to take these middle schoolers and try and integrate them with people that they don't have experience with or conditions they don't have experience with. Mm-hmm. So the younger, the better. And you talked about our next episode when we talked to Debbie, there's, both sides of the coin benefit from it. So
all of that in hand, we have our own understandings of the mental health arena, but Fairview was a completely different entity in its own.
And it's pretty notorious, but most people know when you say Fairview, but for those who don't know, can we do a little bit of what
yeah,
is
we'll
Fairview?
Get into that. Actually, Fairview isn't that well known. Your older residents in Salem and Oregon usually know, because they were alive and working around when this whole thing fell apart, and younger generations don't. Fairview as a structure no longer exists. We'll get into that at the end of the episode as well, but it's just nobody, our age and younger for the most part, don't know about it. And I've had several conversations over the last few months with people, and they're like, Fairview, what is Fairview? You mean Oregon State Hospital? I'm like, no, I don't mean Oregon State Hospital. We have a slew of asylums and mental health facilities here in Oregon that are no longer standing. Oregon State Hospital is not one of those. Oregon State Hospital is still very much in the running.
And it has its own dark history and stuff. But
yeah, and
yeah. I didn't know Fairview all that well either until we started delving into the research. I would not have known if you asked me to take you there. I had no idea the history. But we've driven there a few times, and even though the building doesn't stand the
buildings, it was
the feeling there acreage. Is just. Yeah. I don't know. People talk about those, what you call the imprints. They say if you walk the streets that Jack the Ripper walked, then you can get that imprint in time because of the emotions that were felt. I believe that for Fairview, those emotions are still in that place, building or not.
Very much so, and you can feel it. And we've talked about it in previous episodes as well. As soon as you pass over Strong Road, it's just like a wall hits you, and it's so heavy. It's just...
And it's strange, because I brought this up to you. I think we talked about it the last time we talked about Fairview, but we felt this weird calling to it. I can't tell you how many times we've been there or ended up driving by there, or something keeps bringing us back there. So this is kind of our expression of that, I think.
For me, more so, it's because... Initially, I had a career in the mental health field. I wanted to be a clinical psychologist who worked with people that were a little more hard-pressed to get help because they weren't understood. Their mental illnesses weren't understood. They weren't listened to. They weren't cared for in the way that they needed to be cared for. Because unfortunately, largely, and we're starting to move away from it, but, years ago, 30 to 100 years ago, it's just, we like to medicate people, right? We like to shove the problem into a corner and not handle it. That was my whole reasoning for getting into clinical psychology, and it's, I don't know, there's not a whole lot I can say about my time at the Oregon State Hospital for NDA reasons, and it's unfortunate. But as far as Fairview goes, Fairview was known by several names over the years. It changed a lot of different times, but it was most recently known as Fairview Training Center. It was also known most notably as the State Institution for the Feeble-Minded, but for the sake of continuity and respect, I don't really enjoy using those terms to describe people, we'll be referring to it as a Fairview Training Center throughout the course of this discussion. And there are a lot of miscommunications when people bring up the history of Fairview in Oregon. They often mistake it for the Oregon State Hospital. And while both institutions have overlapping histories, Fairview is a completely separate entity from Oregon State Hospital. It operated from 1908 until its final patient left in I believe, either February or March of 2000. So March 21st of this month will mark the 21st anniversary of Fairview closing its doors. And so over the course of its 92 years of operation, about close to 10,000 people lived most or all of their lives within Fairview. And that's pretty common in older mental health facilities. Oregon State Hospital, when I worked there, had several residents that had been there their entire lives, and they will probably continue the remainder of their lives in that facility. And it's heartbreaking. It's really heartbreaking because nobody wants to deal with these people. Nobody wants to see it. Nobody wants to hear it. Nobody wants to heal it. And the people that do are very far and few between.
On the name, the feeble-minded, like you said, we're not going to be using that because that's a very outdated. Yeah. When you were listening to like all the documentaries and doing your research, I was so blown away by how many times they use like the hard, the R word. That it's drowned out of our society. We don't use it as much anymore. I'm surprised that I've heard it more in the last couple of days while you're doing research than I think I have in the past 20 years. But wasn't it also referred to as that at some point as well?
Yeah, and we won't be using that term at any point in this episode or any concurring episodes. I'm just not comfortable doing so. But yeah, it was a very commonly used term. I mean, it was normalized, right? Just like language was way back when, and then we come into a point in history where it's no longer okay. And don't believe so. I believe it was always referred to in the beginning as the Institution for the Feeble-Minded, and then it just transferred to different variations of Fairview or Training Center or conglomeration of the two. But
okay,
on paper, Fairview was an Oregon-run facility for those with developmental and intellectual disabilities and challenges. It opened in November of 1908 with the intention of rehabilitating and educating children with disabilities so they could function on their own as adults out in the world. That's not exactly how things happened in, the inception of it. But with the new age of technology, psychiatry, and advanced medicine in the 1800s, there existed this idea that doctors could rehabilitate young children into being more productive members of society, right? Because that's what America wants. They want people to make money for them. And these were commonly shared ideas rooted in this naive optimism from social activists and educators around the country. But as history has gone on to show, I was asking Charlie earlier because I couldn't remember this phrase for the life of me. The road to hell is paved with the best of intentions, right? Fairview opened its doors with remediation in mind, but it quickly dissolved into this institution which sought to protect society from behaviors that were deemed unfit to serve among neurotypical individuals. It was supposed to be a place of hope, and it quickly dissolved into something that was not that at all. It quietly became this place where residents became a permanent inhabitant rather than, placed. They were supposed to be there temporarily to learn skills, and that wasn't the case for a lot of their residents.
I can't think of anything more terribly American than the idea of what you don't have a way to contribute to society. Well, then you have no value to society. And
I share that ideal to this day. It's really hard to get out of.
It is. It is. It's so ingrained in our society. Everyone wants to say, go and contribute and contribute in the right way. Like, some people don't think artists contribute to society, right? They look at like expressionist art or modern art and say, well, that's not contributing to society. You're not contributing in the way that I want you to contribute to, so you're worthless to society. Mm-hmm. And it's awful. It
is. And unfortunately, Oregon was not the first or the last to do that kind of thing. So back onto just the overall structure of Fairview, because I know a lot of people, when they're wanting to learn about locations, haunted or otherwise, they'd like to know the physiology of it. So Fairview originally opened on about 700 acres of land southeast of Salem. I think it landed on about 672 acres in total, near Strong Road. There were about 39 patients. I'm going to refer to them as patients. They were not called that. They were called inmates. And they transferred those people from the Oregon State Hospital to Fairview, and they resided there until about 1917, when a commitment law was passed to standardize admissions by imposing an age limit. So at that point, it was about 5 years or older, but the age limit was removed in 1921 to basically allow anyone of any age. And the records that I was able to gain access to had anyone from babies to 92 years old residing at Fairview. The property consisted of a working farm where crops were raised, orchards were sown, cattle, hogs, chickens were raised, and largely the institution was self-sufficient in this way. And up until the late 1960s and 1970s, when Fairview ceased farm labor, they cultivated all of their own eggs, bacon, ham, sausage, chicken, vegetables, fruit, etc. And I couldn't find any documented reason as to why they closed all that down, but you can understand, having people who are there who you're supposed to help and then putting them into farm labor isn't exactly the best thing for people. They also had a laundry building, a boiler house, their administration buildings, and then finally the cottages where patients resided. Those things did not look like cottages at all. They looked like a giant fucking dormitories where they just shoved a bunch of people into, which was pretty common in the Oregon State Hospital and Fairview's history. Within those buildings, within the cottages, there was also an area where they conducted their version of schooling for patients, specifically for patients that they deemed cognizant enough to learn. And there were very many politicians who thought that it was a waste of time and money to educate these kids. They also had doctors on staff, nurses, neurologists, dentists, hairdressers, and they had all of this, but still only had about one care provider assigned to around 80-ish patients at any given time.
That's an outrageous statistic. Like, you think, parents hear about, one teacher to 15 students or one teacher to, 30 students, and that's an outrageous number to hear about. But over double that, and each person has, a special need or something to help them. There's no way one person could cover that many people.
No, and a lot of patients in certain wards were non-ambulatory and non-verbal, and so they couldn't move, they couldn't speak, and so they were just bedridden day in and day out, which breaks my heart. It was similar at Oregon State Hospital. Like I said, we're moving forward in the mental health field, but there's still a lot of stuff that we need to learn. Very quickly, we're going to talk about some of the listed reasons that someone could be institutionalized, not necessarily fully at Fairview, but some of these were part of that process. These were from the early 1800s to early 1900s, and it's not a complete list, but here are some. So brain softening was one, business trouble, childbirth, Christian Science, if you had gotten a concussion, if you were in any kind of domestic trouble, if you had disappointment in love, if you had dementia, if you had epilepsy, if you had exposure and solitude, which basically boils down to social isolation and behaviors elicited from being socially isolated and in like any types of neglect and that type of thing. Fright, financial trouble, grief, general debility, injury and religion, insomnia, menopause, old age, pneumonia, spiritualism, tobacco use, worry, hysterectomies, if you had a hysterectomy that you could potentially be institutionalized, if you were old, if you had symptoms of starvation, if you masturbated, if you had sunstroke, and basically at any point, if you were orphaned or you were poor, you were also at a higher rate to be institutionalized. And this wasn't just with Fairview, right? Like, we have history across all of America that you could basically, if you did not like your kid, if you didn't like your wife, you could be like, nope, you're depressed, off to the loony bin you go. And like I was telling Charlie when I was doing my research and I came across this, I was just like, I hit so many of those check marks that had I been born 100 years earlier, I most likely would have been institutionalized.
I think this list is a good reason for when people, I know that, when you're talking politics, people always talk about slippery slopes and, like, oh, well, the government would never do that, or, you're being outrageous. But, and this was what, we say 100 years ago, but even 30, 50 years ago, this was happening to people. So
to put it into perspective, we were dabbling in eugenics until the 1940s, and lobotomies weren't outlawed until 1981 in Oregon.
Yeah.
That's not that long ago.
Don't trust your government.
It's mind-boggling to me that basically if you disagreed with anything that wasn't a social norm, that you were subject to this.
Right, and there's what's the defense against that? I mean,
I'm sad, so I need to be institutionalized. I don't.
And once
get
you're
it.
in the system, right, then it's easy for them to say, well, you don't know what's best for you. You can't take care of yourself. And then you're stuck. You're there.
Yeah, which is another whole other issue, at least in America. I don't know what it's like in other countries, but here, it's a really controversial subject because yes, we're pushing forward to talking about mental illness and being more open to it, to discussing it and normalizing it. But that comes with little asterisks at the end of it, right? Because the more open you are about it means the more of that is on paper, and
they'll use that against you.
We're not trying to be like anti-government. We're not trying to be those people, but that's the reality of it. That, like, seriously, that's the reality of it. I have my diagnosis on paper. Charlie doesn't.
But I still went to the doctor, and they asked me like a general checkup.
Yeah.
They're just like, do you sometimes feel sad? I mean, we're in the middle of a pandemic. What, like 500,000 people are dead. Like,
yeah, I'm a little sad.
Well, it'll be a little bit unusual if I wasn't sad every now and then. We've had to be locked in our home for a year, and there's nothing but fear and panic in the media. So I would be more concerned if I was like, no, I'm perfectly happy. What are you asking about? Like that's the red flag for me.
Exactly. And we'll talk briefly about a bill that is being pushed into Congress right now that nobody is really talking about our right to bear arms. And there are things in there that say if you have ever been suicidal, which again, understandable for not wanting someone who is suicidal own a gun. I can understand that. But if you have any history of mental illness, anxiety included, you are no longer allowed to exercise your right to bear arms in the United States if this passes.
Well, it goes beyond that, even then saying that a psychiatrist approved by the Attorney General has to clear you, and that's very political. The Attorney General is, that's an elected position, so a very left-leaning place could have a very left-leaning Attorney General who gets a psychiatrist who says, oh, no one's mentally competent to own a gun because I don't believe anyone should have. And then done. Law.
Yeah. And since we're on the topic of government and trusting or not trusting them, a large question that is presented a lot in the mental health field, especially on understanding how we allowed things like this to happen, is the fact that families, parents, society, etc., were basically conditioned to trust doctors and to trust our leaders and medical professionals to know what the fuck they're talking about, right? And so you have people that are putting their kids and family members into Fairview's care because they were told that that was the best option for everyone involved. They were told that they had the resources, they had the education, they had everything that they needed to take care of their disabled kids in a way that they said that the parents couldn't. Most families felt as though they had no other choice, and in every regard, they thought they were doing the right thing for their loved ones. They thought they were doing the right thing for their kids. Debbie, when you listen to her interview, her mom and her sister is the exact same situation, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you think that you're doing the right thing, and because why shouldn't you trust your doctors?
Right.
Why shouldn't you trust?
We're having those conversations to this day, right? With COVID and all that, you have, Fauci on the radio coming out and saying things, and, he told us not to wear masks, and everyone trusted him because he was the authority on it. And then he came back later and said, well, no, I was wrong. You should be wearing masks, but it's too late. The damage was done, right? And
I think that there should be some recognition for him saying, hey, I'm wrong. Let's go about this the right, because people don't do that either.
Right, but once
I
you've
get what
lost
you're
that
saying.
trust, and then next time we do Charlie's Conspiracy Corner, we can talk about the Tuskegee syphilis trials, where basically the government hired a bunch of doctors to tell patients they were being treated and then give them placebos so they could study the effects of syphilis over an extended period of time. So they intentionally did not care for people so they could study them without telling them. So again, government's not always watching out for you.
No. And what do you do in that scenario, right? Like, what do you do? Especially from a sociological aspect where you are shamed in society for having a family member or having a child that isn't fitting this cookie cutter stereotype that we want everyone to be in this country. And so you get shamed. You deal with a whole litany of things that I've never had to experience, but I've seen it in other people in their history, where they come to a point where doctors are telling them as soon as that child is born, and if they have any flicker of developmental or intellectual disability, they're like, nope, Fairview. And if they didn't go to Fairview, and if we're talking at an earlier point, there are too many instances of families just disappearing those kids. And whether that means they buried them in the backyard or they shipped them off somewhere, I don't know. There's records of both of those things happening, and unfortunately it was too common.
That's something that's been going on since like the dawn of man, right? We watched a movie a while ago, a horror movie about the old like English countryside houses that were built with like those attics, right, where they could hide.
Oh, there was that there was that one movie we watched, and I can't remember the title of it now, but yeah, sometimes
they specifically built rooms in your house to hide your family members that you didn't want to talk about, and this
windowless
is like
attics, windowless basements where you just
it could be literally Sophie's choice. If you have two children and one is quote normal and one of them's not, and you're living in a society that doesn't accept them, you could lose your job, you could lose social standing, and do you put your family in jeopardy for one child? Do you sacrifice your other child's childhood and quote sorts and sense of normalcy? There's no right answer, and none of these were easy for those families.
No. And again, when you think you're doing the right thing, right?
Because you're being told, everyone's patting you on the back and said you're making the right choice, you're helping them. And it's easy to buy into, and why shouldn't you? The doctors are telling you, the government's telling you, everyone else is doing it, so.
And of course there's the other side of the coin, right, where people dumped their loved ones into state-run facilities because they didn't want to deal with it at all, or they just didn't like the person. And there's accounts of orphans and children who were victims of neglect who were simply dropped off at Fairview because they had nowhere else to go. Those were all very common occurrences. And so you would have children, you would have people at Fairview and other mental facilities that didn't exactly
didn't belong.
No. I mean, nobody should have belonged in those places, but, for the sake of discussion, no, by all rights, they should not have been there. And like we talked about, young children who were disabled were labeled as objects to be ashamed of, and their existence wiped from family histories. I've been watching a lot of interviews and talking to a lot of people who they didn't even know they had siblings until later in life, because they were either told that their brothers or sisters were dead, or they just didn't talk about them. And from my own experience, I have a family member. Her name was Lily. She was my great aunt, and she dealt with a lot of, mental health problems too. And for the way that my family talks about her, they just treat her like she was a disease. There aren't very many pictures of her. There aren't many documents about her, and she basically doesn't exist. She doesn't exist, and that's just too fucking common. And again, it's another one of those heartbreaking things that I struggle so hard to understand why. Anyway, now that we've established the property and the patients of Fairview, what exactly happened at Fairview. It's no mystery that in the 1800s and the 1900s, we left little to be desired in the way of mental health care. And while Fairview is not the worst of the facilities that America erected, it certainly wasn't one of the best, and Charlie and I will do our absolute best to handle this evidence with the grace and dignity that the patients deserve. Oftentimes when we discuss tragedies or anything of the macabre, we forget that these people are in fact people. They had families, they had their special little things that gave them joy. And many former residents of Fairview are still with us today. Their families still bear the bruises of that experience. they still are pretty active in the mental health field. They're pretty active in Fairview history. And so I would beseech you, if you want to do your own research, if you want to conduct your own interviews, please treat these people with respect. They've gone through enough.
Well, and they're still going through it. I hope I'm not jumping ahead here, but when Fairview closed, there was no place for a lot of the patients to go, and so they ended up on the streets of Oregon.
Yeah, in Salem.
So that for some people, the nightmare didn't end when it closed the doors. It's just a new challenging chapter where they continue to be isolated and not get help. So,
right.
Again, like we said at the beginning of the episode, this is a darker, harder episode with some harder content, but it needs to be said.
It does. And I also think it's really important to note that there were good people working in Fairview. Not every single person there was physically or sexually abusing their patients. There were a ton of caregivers present that genuinely cared and provided for their residents. And I think in situations like this, people also forget that not everyone working in these kinds of places are Nurse Ratched. A lot of us in the mental health field enter it because we want to help people. We typically have experiences of our own with family members, or even on a personal level, like Charlie and I talked about, or at least from like my perspective. As a person who did work at the Oregon State Hospital, I went there because I wanted to help and heal. Largely, administrations and government don't. You get a lot of mental health providers that get shuffled into this system that is not adequately prepared to care for people. And that's a whole other topic for another day.
Right? How do you... it's your first day. You just got hired. You're fresh out of college, and you have this idea of, I'm going to go here and help people. And you're told, okay, you have to go watch those 80 people. You're going to be underpaid. There's no toys. There's no food. There's no, now go and do the best you can. Like, I don't even know how you can handle that. I don't even imagine how do you keep your spirits up when you've got those conditions.
I personally didn't. I couldn't. That's why I left Oregon State Hospital, and that's all I can say about that. I couldn't. And yeah, so with all of that being said, the atrocities that we're going to be covering in a moment are really hard to listen to. So if you need to fast forward, by all means do so. And as always, I'll place a trigger warning in the show notes for those who wish to bypass this section of the episode, so you can completely skip it altogether if you'd like. Fairview, how are people treated? Patients were separated into different cottages based on gender, disability, and severity of disability and age. So it was common to hear stories from patients that detailed attempts of them trying to run away from Fairview, although they were always brought back. It's also common for patients with higher functioning abilities to take care of those who could not take care of themselves due to lack of care staff, right? Because one of the biggest issues with Fairview, and one of the biggest issues with basically mental health facilities in general, is that they were always overcrowded and they were always underfunded. And so just imagine someone who is higher functioning having to take care of someone who is not, who has no training, who has no history, who has no understanding on how to care for anyone and can hardly care for themselves, babysitting other patients. Because that's what was happening at Fairview a large part of the time. Plenty of video that shows evidence and proof of that. And it was also not an uncommon thing in the beginning to find children housed with older patients with severe violent mental illnesses. And I don't say violent to demonize anyone, but there are mental illnesses that people suffer with that have violent tendencies, and for whatever reason that I'll never understand, they put children in with those people. Patients were also separated into varying levels of physical and cognitive ability for labor. Labor was divided up according to stereotypical gender roles, so if you were deemed able, women would do the laundry and sewing needed in the facility, where men were expected to do the farm labor that lent Fairview its meat, dairy, and produce. And it was thought that teaching these skills was another way to prepare residents for skills outside of the institution, right? But as time went on, it hardly seemed that was the case. And there was this diagram, for lack of a better word, that showed steps in mental development and how they graded these people. And I'm going to use their terms. They are not my terms. Please do not come at me. Just for historical accuracy, this is what we're going to use. So their steps in mental development, at the very base level, they called this the self-preservation stage, which they labeled as idiot. Those who were able to do simple menial work were called low-grade imbeciles. Those who were able to do simple manual work were medium-grade imbeciles. Who were able to do complex manual work were high-grade imbeciles. And those who were able to complete all of those things, plus work requiring reason and judgment, were labeled as morons. Now, we know those as insults in today's political climate, but for a large part of our history, those were words used to describe those who were dealing with disabilities. Based on those grades, they would put them into different labor forces at the hospital. And there was a news article that came out in June of 1984 when investigators went into Fairview, and in the span of a single month, they found just 1 month. This isn't calculated for the entirety of its history of existence, but in 1 month, they found 641 injuries and 27 reports of sexual abuse. 1 month. It was surprising to me when I was doing my interviews and doing my research to find out how much sexual abuse happened in that facility. Anytime I did research or worked with, in the mental health industry, yes, that was a component, but it wasn't drilled in as much as the negligent care was, or the working conditions, or the medical violations and all of that. The medical violations are pretty much the top tier thing that you hear when you look about the history of mental health facilities.
I think that's just American morals, though, again, right? Like, we can talk about the gruesome details. If someone was murdered, they have no problem talking about the murder, but the second you mention sex, it's taboo. A taboo topic.
Yeah.
So it's strange that even when we're talking about a taboo topic like this, it's already brushed under. Sex is still, and sex abuse is like still a taboo of a taboo. It's somehow worse of the worst, even though we're talking about these people being mistreated and abused, but there's still something, too sacred to talk about, and that's it's messed up priorities.
And information on Fairview in general was really hard to find and get. There are very few records of the people that stayed at Fairview. Finding people that want to talk about it is a whole other avenue. I was able to talk to a handful of individuals. One you'll hear the interview with here in our next episode. A few others I talked to over email. They didn't want to do interviews, but they wanted to tell bits and pieces of their story. They just weren't comfortable being on the phone, which is totally understandable. It's a really hard subject to deal with, especially if you were a resident there. No one that I talked to said that it was a good experience. It doesn't go to say that there weren't good experiences there for some people, because there were, but on average that wasn't what was happening. So that being said, the sexual abuse was rampant though, and considering Fairview had records of hiring sex offenders into caregiver positions, that's not super surprising. On-site patients were physically slapped, they were beaten, they were scalded with hot water, they were tied to beds. Cow whips were part of punishments, and on one account, a former Fairview resident described being tied into a laundry bag that was hung up from the rafters in the laundry building and left by himself. When he was asked how long that was, he didn't have the capacity to calculate that, so we don't know. Wrist restraints and straitjackets were used, segregation and large cages to separate patients. These were kids too, remember, it wasn't just adults there, but kids. Those were used to segregate patients from one another if they were deemed too aggressive or unruly. Wet sheets, which is a method of lying in wrapped cold wet sheets, was a form of hydrotherapy that was used, but many patients at Fairview claim it was used as a form of restraint and punishment rather than having any therapeutic value. In 1994, 14 Fairview employees were investigated for ongoing physical abuse. Only 11 were arrested. And I want to talk briefly about a couple cases that were pretty notorious to come out of Fairview. One of those is about Jeannie Landers, who was an 18-year-old girl who was murdered and found at Silver Falls State Park in 1979. So she went missing on March 9th, 1979. She was 18 years old. She was a patient at Fairview, and police records state that she possessed an intellectual disability and harbored the mind of an 8-year-old child. She was 5'1", she was 105 pounds, and the Marion County DA's office said that she had a reputation for being unexpectedly strong for her stature and quite feisty. Her body was found 5 days later in the Silver Falls area, and evidence showed that she was dumped there after being brutally beaten and stabbed. Cause of death was shown to be blunt force trauma, and she had not been sexually assaulted, which I'm incredibly grateful for, but I'm a little surprised considering her perpetrator's history, because he was a sex offender. He had a strong history of sexual offenses. Police were unable to find leads, and eventually Janie's case went cold until about 2015. Throughout the entirety of this time, her sister Joyce was pushing police to reopen it, to keep looking, and 2015, 2016 is when they finally got leads. The case was reassigned to the Oregon State Police with a detective known as Steve Hinkle. Through his investigation, he was able to determine that the knife used on Janie was one without a hilt, making it likely that her attacker was hurt during the struggle. They isolated the blood on her clothing and matched it to Gerald Kenneth Dunlap in April of 2016. So Gerald was a laundry worker at Fairview around the mid-1970s and worked there until 1983 when he was fired for inappropriate behavior towards women. He was convicted in 1996 on a sexual assault charge related to a family member, and ended up passing away in prison in 2002. So I don't believe he was ever formally charged with anything involving Janie. But the family has closure now. They were able to say, yep, this was the guy. And that is one of the larger cases that came out of there. Another case was with Catherine Stockton. Catherine was a resident at Fairview in 1979, and she had been raped by an aide working in Fairview. She was one of the few women who hadn't been sterilized by Fairview's Eugenics Initiative, and the aide that did sexually assault her was known as Emmanuel Sistrunk, who was a convicted rapist hired by Fairview to care for severely disabled and bedridden, non-ambulatory women. Kathy, as well as another patient, were both victims of Emmanuel and ended up pregnant. Both children were adopted out once born, and Emmanuel only served 2 years for his crimes at Fairview, which really pisses me off. And a social worker went on trial to testify that the rape was in fact consensual, even though Catherine was nonverbal and non-ambulatory. He went on to serve about 30 years of prison sentence for raping an 11-year-old girl, and later evidence was found that Emmanuel assaulted 5 other women at Fairview, and there were 3 other separate pregnancies that were found, and I don't believe he was charged for those either, and he passed away in prison in 2016.
So just to clarify, Fairview knew he was a convicted rapist and still hired him to...
I don't know that, and I'm not going to go on record saying that. I don't know if they knew prior to hiring him, because as we know, in the early 1900s and the late 60s and 70s, we didn't exactly have the most pristine of hiring processes.
Right. Well, that's just how the article is written that I drew that conclusion, as well as the way that they say that he was known as kind of tells me that, like you said, hiring practices, maybe he had different names, different identities. Technology's helped us in a lot of ways, and I'd like to think that technology nowadays prevents that from happening, but...
Yeah, I really don't know. The thing that bothers me the most is the social worker that went on the stand and said, yep, completely consensual. A social worker went into that facility. How can you go on the stand and say that shit was consensual?
I'm guessing
and excuse
it was
my
political.
language, but it just...
this is obviously super embarrassing for Fairview, and they were still operating at the time, so to make it look less embarrassing, they paid someone off to come out and make these statements so that it doesn't look quite as bad for them. That's my opinion. Obviously, I don't know that that's factually what happened, but that would be my best guess.
That's the general consensus from most of the research that I've done too. And oh god, it pisses me off so much. So much. It was done. It happened, and there's nothing we can do to change that now. But I'm hoping going forward that Department of Human Services and social workers, at least in the state of Oregon, have a little bit more training and a little bit more compassion and a little bit more spine to stand up for injustices instead of pushing them to the side so nobody will know about them because they don't fit society's mold for how you're supposed to be. And it makes me wonder that if it wasn't that type of facility, that if it happened somewhere else, if it would have been shoved under the rug as much, because the victims were those with disabilities. We won't know. We can't know.
No.
But we're going to jump back to 1923 for a second and talk about the Eugenics Movement, because that was something that really set the bar for how our state and many other states in our country handled eugenics. And for our younger listeners who aren't as familiar with eugenics, by definition, it's the study of how to arrange reproduction within the human population to increase the occurrence of heritable and desirable traits. It was developed by Sir Francis Galton as a method of improving the human race, and in short, a perfect visualization of eugenics is what Hitler attempted, right? As a society, we deemed it acceptable to choose what traits and behaviors we wanted to see, and anyone who didn't fit that bill either was killed or their ability to reproduce was taken away from him. That happened at Fairview as well. Something a lot of people don't know is Dr. Owens Adair, who was a frontliner for the women's suffragette movement in the state of Oregon, was also a very prominent leader in pushing the eugenics legislation here in Oregon. And in 1907, she lobbied for the legislature for the implementation of a sterilization bill intended to, improve society. Passed in 1909, as did a similar bill in Washington, but it was vetoed by Oregon's governor at the time, but then was passed again in 1923, and it stuck then. It remained as law until 1983, and it caused the forced sterilization of over 2,500 people in Oregon's prisons and mental health institutions. So what does that mean? Oregon's Board of Eugenics, the forced sterilization of anyone who was deemed insane, feeble-minded. These are not my words. These are what is placed in the Oregon Board of Eugenics descriptions. Feeble-minded, those who had epilepsy, sexual deviancy, repeat criminal offenses, anyone who fit into those bills. They were required to basically sign up for sterilization before leaving Fairview, and it required the person's consent or court order. Parents could sign consent forms for their children, but I've seen video and interviews from former residents that had been there as young children, and parents often signed consent forms to have their children sterilized without their children's consent. And most patients didn't understand what they were signing, and by the time some of them did realize what was going on, their rights had already been taken away, and it was too late.
And this is something, again, we try and say we've moved forward today, but if you go on the internet, horrible, horrible place, I don't recommend it, but people still talk about eugenics and talk about forced sterilization, that we should have forced sterilization nowadays for people on welfare or for people they disagree with and all that. And it just goes back to, you just read this list of reasons why someone could be forced sterilized or even sterilized without knowing it. Like, who would you trust? Who would you give the power to say who can and cannot have children that you believe would not abuse that power?
You can't, because people have biases and people can be bought, and there's all these other extenuating and external factors that can go into that decision, and there isn't a way to do so, nor should it be.
Exactly. That's too much power for one human to have. Even a council, you give it to a 500-member board, and you're still going to have disagreement with their decisions. So it's just, neither of those things are a power that any person should loom over someone else.
Let's look at Fairview now. So, like Charlie mentioned, Fairview closed in spring of 2000. Patients were moved to either back to their families, to outlying facilities, to group homes. But unfortunately, some ended up being put out onto the streets. And not immediately, though, right? A lot of people tried to work with different group homes to get the best care for their loved ones. It's this weird thing where Fairview didn't have the best care, but it was still somewhat better than a lot of group homes because they had people who had been with these residents for years, and they knew how to handle them, they knew how to help them, they knew all that. And moving anyone to a new location, it's upsetting. It's challenging, right? It's a change of pay. It's just, especially with anyone dealing with a lot on their plate and putting a new environment on top of it, it's hard. And unfortunately, a lot of those situations don't pan out in favor of the patient, and they can end up homeless. A lot of Fairview's residents did. They closed. Linda Geer, who was a former resident of Fairview, was a leading part in the People First movement to arise out of Fairview also, which was something that happened in the 1970s, which Oregon was also the first state to have such a thing. And People First is a group that moved to help people share experiences about their services they were experiencing in Fairview and to become their own advocates for care and equal rights. And if you look today, the website is that they put up is used for information to connect to people first groups all around the world, including meetings, events, conferences, and a place to share resources. So Fairview, as we talked about before, is no longer standing. It's no longer there. It's there was a change.org petition to allow former residents, historians, and families to take photos and say their goodbyes before this happened. I honestly don't know if they were afforded the opportunity. I couldn't find evidence that suggested it one way or the other.
Well, there's still one part standing, right? The laundry building,
room, yeah.
And they're trying to save that and turn it into like a yoga spa.
Which Sustainable Fairview Associates purchased around 275 acres of the former Fairview grounds in around 2002, which included a lot of historic buildings and cottages and stuff. And then in 2004, they sold about 32 acres of their holdings to Sustainable Development, Inc. for building Pringle Creek Community, which was supposed to be another sustainable housing development. Aside from that, currently, everything else was demolished and bought out by Mountain West Investment Corp. to build upscale apartment buildings. As of March of this year, most of those apartments have been completed. There's still some work to be done, but people are living there. There's a playground that they built on the property, which is really ominous to me considering the history. Yeah.
I don't understand why anyone wants to live there. We talked, when you hear the next episode, we talked to Debbie about that as well, but I couldn't imagine, like, every time we've gone on there, it feels awful. I couldn't imagine living in that 24/7. I wouldn't want to live that way, and maybe the people there don't feel it. We've talked about maybe interviewing some of them or talking to them.
Some people don't know the history, though, so how are you're not open to that kind of thing, and you don't know? You just might not know. And the same thing happened with Damish, where a whole bunch of really upscale, nice houses and stuff were built on the remnants of Damish State Hospital up in Wilsonville, and it has that same air about it. Yeah, it's I don't know. I couldn't live there personally. It feels so bad.
Well, also
there.
To be fair on that point, right? What part of America hasn't had something horrible happen on it in the last 250, 300 years? So I guess
that's a fair point.
Anywhere
But
where you
this is
go,
so recent. It's so recent, and that to me is the defining factor for this. And like, yeah, you can go into the South and go to the old Civil War reenactment places and the Battle of Gettysburg and all that stuff, but comparatively, timeline-wise, these are much fresher wounds.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense.
Now that we've kind of shared the history of Fairview, if you are interested in looking at video and media, OPB's In the Shadow of Fairview is a phenomenal documentary that was released last December. You can watch it on YouTube. I believe there's also a link to it on OPB's website. I'll link all of these in our show notes so you can check those out. In Our Care is a short 10-minute video, I believe, that was filmed in 1958 of these two guys that went into Fairview and documented how it looked there. There's another documentary called Where's Molly? It was made in 2007. It's a documentary about Molly Daly, who was institutionalized at the Fairview Hospital and Training Center in the 1950s. There's another movie. Fairview was used as a filming location. It has nothing to add to the mental health aspect of this, but if you're into wanting to see pieces of Fairview, Population 2 is a post-apocalyptic film that was filmed there and contains some of the last footage of the center taken before it began being torn down in 2011. So all of that I'll link into the show notes. When Oregon State Hospital opens back up again, they have a museum, and a lot of stuff from Fairview, a lot of information and stuff can be found there as well. So all of that aside, let's get into the paranormal activity, and I'll lend Charlie the mic for a little bit since I've been talking a little bit.
So there's a couple different paranormal things there, and as you know, anything that's got history on it is going to attract the paranormal investigators, and we tried our hardest to approach this as history first, but I undeniably think that place is haunted, as we've talked about a few times. Like, the feeling when you go there, the feeling when you walk around there is just overwhelming. As far as paranormal activity goes there, our first experience was talking with Tim King about the area. We've talked about Tim King quite a few times before, and he literally wrote the book on Haunted Salem, and you can't do a Haunted Salem without Haunted Fairview. He himself had gone up there quite a few times and did different things on it, and we were inspired when we talked to him about it to then make our own way up there. And we drove up there in the middle of the night. I think it was like 8 or 9 at night.
Which wasn't intentional. We don't do ghost hunting at night for the scare factor. It's just we work a lot, and that was the only free time we had.
Yeah, so we went up there, drove around, and at the time there was no trespassing signs. They were still doing construction, so we ended up on some old dirt roads and didn't even know we weren't supposed to be there, but there was nothing to tell us not to go there.
And there was an old building, which we found out later was the old laundry room.
Right. We brought our dowsing rods and our equipment, and
that's where we met Gwen.
Yeah.
And Gwen, and I guess that's another draw that I have to... this was a point that I was trying to make earlier on in our recording, but I completely lost my point. I didn't want to backtrack. As someone who worked in the mental health field, I've always been incredibly drawn to old asylum history, not just Oregon's, but across the world. It's something I've always been drawn to. I've always wanted to learn about the people there, because you only hear about the scary incidents, you only hear about the abuse, you only hear about, the lobotomies, the medical abnormalities, and all of that stuff. I don't want to know that. I want to know about the people. I want to know why they were there. I want to know about their families. I want to know about what they like, everything about them. And you don't get to see any of that, which was one of my greatest frustrations when working on researching the Oregon State Hospital and Damish and Fairview. It's just so hard to find that information, which is a real bummer, because in order to verify a lot of the paranormal activity that we've gotten, we need records. And I don't know if we'll ever be able to get those with Gwen. Do you remember much about our initial meeting with her? Because I don't.
I just remember neither of us felt good about being there. There was definitely a heavy presence and an unhappy presence, but they were willing to talk, because that's our opening question is, well, will you talk with us? And sometimes it's no, and it's like, okay, well then we'll be on our way. But Gwen was willing to talk, and
she did communicate for a little bit, but largely Gwen is nonverbal. She's not a very talkative girl. She doesn't like talking about her experience at Fairview. She did say that she was a resident there, that she was 12 to 13 years old, I believe. She really likes playing with toys. She really likes cartoons. She likes being around the other kids that we have here. And other than that, she's really chill. She's really nice.
Yeah, I don't think I've really heard a peep out of her since then.
No, she's content just being in a safe environment, which is completely understandable, considering.
And then we've talked about in the past when we went to Dimash, we got someone who followed us, and that was a completely different experience.
That is one of the first spirits that has followed us home that we had to kick out for personal safety reasons. I got icky vibes coming off of that person, and then Charlie had an instance where they really liked to touch Charlie's hair.
They liked touching my hair, and then all night while we were sleeping, the door was just opening and slamming, like not even just once, twice. It was a good 7, 8, 9 times, and
they stood at the foot of the bed a few times.
Could not sleep.
I know this is odd to anyone that isn't used to paranormal activity. For me, when stuff like that happens, it's very rare. You don't typically see stuff moving a lot, and it takes a lot of energy for that stuff to happen. It was annoying as fuck. The one ground rule that I typically lay in place for anything that wants to stay with us is you have free roam of the house. Our bedroom is off limits, because you gotta have one place that's ours,
Yeah.
They refused to respect that boundary, and I could not deal with it.
Well, and it wasn't even really our choice. I think McCorkle kind of got sick of it real fast, because McCorkle was sketchy, to say the least, about the situation to start with, and I think he got tired of it very quickly as well. And
for those of you who are new listeners, and if this is the first episode you're listening to and you don't know who McCorkle is our older Irish gentleman who ended up coming home with us too. And if you'd like to learn more about McCorkle, or basically our whole Tavra's traveling tavern for wayward spirits, just go back a few episodes and you can learn about that. I know people hearing it for the first time are like, who the fuck are these people?
I wouldn't recommend this as a first episode, just because it's, again, deep and heavy and chewy. Go listen to the wrestling episode. That one's happier.
What was that? Jamie Fraser versus something?
I think that's the Thanos and KFC episode.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know.
It's much happier. This
Yeah.
is a grim one, but we got Gwen there. I think the last couple times we've gone back up there, we've done some pictures, and there's a school on those grounds as well. We think.
Yeah, and we'll get into Hillcrest because that's a whole other situation.
Oh yeah, sorry, that's on your list. I didn't forget what it was called.
No, it's okay. It's Hillcrest. So as far as paranormal experiences that other people have had, Kozer Cottage, I talked to someone who said that they saw shadow-like apparitions, small shadow-like apparitions, and in the shape of a child in one of the windows. They had reports of being touched. And this was all before the buildings were demolished, right? So these are really old accounts.
Right.
And I spoke with one other person who wishes to remain anonymous, that she had been grabbed by her shoulders on one occasion while out urban exploring Fairview and had her leg grabbed several times. She had been poked, grabbed, and heard footsteps running around up and down the stairs when the cottages were still erect, which, funny enough, I tend to believe her on that aspect purely because when working with Oregon State Hospital, which is another haunted location, I had several instances of footsteps running up and down the stairs, which, that doesn't seem abnormal in context, so I'm going to give you some of that context. When there were codes, whether they be code blue, which were medical emergencies, or code green, which were behavioral emergencies, whenever that code was called out, anyone in the surrounding areas had to respond to it. And we had stairways, which was the easiest way, that looped around the entirety of the ward and went up several flights that you could go up and down. And anytime you heard some people responding to those codes, you would hear tons of footsteps echoing up and down those stairwells. So that's a pretty common thing. And so when there aren't codes and you're working night shift, like I was working night shift at 3:00 in the morning, and you suddenly hear dozens of footsteps running up and down those stairwells and there's nobody there, it's a little concerning. As far as Tim King, I know Charlie touched on that while I was taking a water break. Tim detailed several accounts of activity in his book Haunted Salem. He describes an account of an older woman who patrols the grounds of the institution, and it's been observed in the late hours of the night, as has another non-denominational ghost who appears near one of the cottages. As far as Hillcrest, let me grab his book here because we're going to read directly out of it as far as what his accounts were. So one of the more gruesome things, and we were out at Hillcrest recently, so that school is still there, but in Tim's research, there were a lot of reports about underground tunnels spanning all the way from Fairview to the Hillcrest School, and I wasn't able to find any accounts to validate this. But I trust Tim's word. He was a reporter for many, many, many years, so I assume that he's done his research. So nobody today has been able to validate that. Basically, people said that there's a graveyard, an unmarked graveyard cemetery in the area with dozens of bodies in it. Don't know if that's true. It's not known if the gravestones were simply removed or if the bodies were reinterred somewhere else. We don't know, but...
Which is why we are so concerned over finding that hole. We're like, oh God, we found the graveyard and there's an open hole.
Did we?
In our last episode, we talked about that hole that we found in the ground.
No, I just couldn't remember if we had talked about it, if we needed to re-illustrate it.
No, we talked about the hole, so I don't know if excited is the right word. It's like, oh, it's something, but what we found was almost worse.
I was pretty sketched out. We didn't stay there for very long. But reading from Tim's book here, perhaps the saddest and most documented haunting at Fairview is that of the ghost of a small boy, a student named Holly Pollock, who went missing in November of 1923, and then shockingly began to show up in the most terrible way. His hair and skin particles began to flow through the school's water pipes. He was gone for about 3 weeks, and then his decomposing body was found in the well. I couldn't find any news articles that detailed that situation, but considering the time period, I'm assuming they didn't exactly want to advertise that.
Probably not.
Yeah, the boy's death was deemed a drowning, presumably accidental, but it does seem fair to ask the question, why would he climb into a well and drown himself when he could easily just leave? The authorities thought that he had run away, which, considering Fairview, that is a possibility. But it is also distinctly possible that the boy was murdered and his body dumped into a well. The old well has been covered since, but many believe that Holly is still nearby. We had a very interesting interaction concerning that day when we went up to the Hillcrest School and Fairview and the correctional center that is just on the other side of Fairview.
it looks very similar. I mean, I think it was built around the same time because the architecture was similar, and we thought, oh, we found part of Fairview that hasn't been destroyed yet.
Yeah, and I got really excited, but that's not the case. It's a correctional institution. There were Fairview patients when they had a really long waiting list. They would take some of those patients and put them over in Hillcrest, and then they moved them back and forth. And we're going to be doing an episode on that correctional facility. But we went there when we thought it was Fairview. It was the amount of energy I felt walking into that place, or not into that place, but outside, because it's still owned by Oregon Youth Authority, and I very much do not want to go to jail. And so we stayed outside of the no trespassing areas. We had the dowsing rods, and then we had basically my own, clairsentient thing going on, and I kept getting, I really hate the word vision. I really hate it, but I get pictures in my head sometime, and all I could see was this room, like an old long gym with windows along either side, and like all those kids wanted to do was sit down and play. That's all they wanted to do. And there were so many kids, and I could not keep track of anything because there were so many, and it was just like this buzzing in my head. And like kind of like how when we went to Wilhelm Memorial Mausoleum, it was the same scenario. You just there's so much going on that you just can't keep track of it. And I have a theory, and there's no way to validate this, but I have a theory that when Fairview's buildings got demolished, that a lot of those people, the ones that aren't still there, kind of migrated over to the buildings at Hillcrest. That was my impression, but again, there's no way to vet that.
Right, but I guess I would agree with that, just because you think about, we talk about all the time, ghosts are people too, right? So like, why would a ghost just hang out on an empty dirt field now, right? So if there was buildings nearby full of other spirits, why not go over there? But at the same time, we visited remote graveyards with nothing else around and talked to people who happen to be still hanging out at the graveyard. So
yeah, so I don't know.
We can't prove it one way or another, but to me it makes sense. Your home's been destroyed, but there's a home right next door. They welcome you in. There's other people to play with. Why wouldn't you?
Okay, so there's one more thing I wanted to share as far as Fairview goes. So they had a paper that circulated Fairview called The Pipeline. It was a bi-weekly publication, and they did a Halloween article, a Halloween horror story that went around Fairview. Okay. And I wanted to read that to you because they wrote it specifically for the residents in Fairview so they would recognize like the locations and stuff.
Was it written by staff, or was it written by people staying there?
Staff.
Okay.
As far as I'm aware.
To clarify that.
As far as I'm aware, it was staff.
Okay,
so
let's do it.
It's called The Haunting of Fairview. It was dark and stormy that Halloween morning as she pulled her car into the parking lot at Fairview Training Center. Typical Oregon weather, she muttered to herself. Or was it? There was a strange feeling in the atmosphere, something she could not put her finger on. She shrugged it off and climbed the stairs to the LeBreton cottage, and that was her first mistake. She pulled open the door that led into this massive building, which had been built just after the turn of the century. People had not lived in it for almost a decade. Several staff now had offices in this building, and hers was one of them. That not quite right feeling came over her again, and she walked down the hall to the HD office. The old building seemed colder than usual, and the pipes from the steam heat changed and whistled and almost sounded like screaming. Her uneasiness grew as she recalled hearing tales of ghosts at Fairview from the night shift staff. She'd always discounted their ghosts as noisy pipes, sleepwalking clients, and lack of sleep on their part. Now she wished she hadn't been so hasty. She laughed nervously at herself for having such thoughts as she opened the door HD. This was her second mistake. She failed to look up as she entered the office. "Where is everyone?" she asked. And then she saw what she thought was a person sitting behind the desk. The reply made her stop dead in her tracks. "Hee hee hee hee," a voice cackled behind her. "They're gone. All gone." She turned slowly and came face to face with an old green warded nose and a pointed black hat. "A witch!" she screamed as she made a fast exit. Breathing heavy, she ran for the administration building, which was her third mistake. Her hair stood on end when she was greeted at the door by yet another witch, and the display case at the front desk were orange heads covered with teeth and blood and brains. This really does not seem like something you should be reading to children.
I was just thinking that, like,
I haven't read this whole through, so She ran out into the rain, blinded by her fear. She headed for Hoff Cottage. She had friends there, and she knew they would help her. This was her fourth mistake. The rain had made her shoes wet, which caused her to slide in the dark room at Hoff. Out of the blackness, someone, or something, grabbed her and put something over her eyes. Stumbling blindly in the dark, she bumped into objects. Strange, wispy things touched her face. She could hear voices, but could see no faces. Though totally disoriented, she managed to find her way out of the building. As frightened as she was, she couldn't help but think of the people living on Martin. They would never be warned. They would need to be protected. She fought her way through the storm to this cottage. This was her fifth mistake. Making a lot of mistakes. The halls were deserted as she searched for signs of life. Fear swelled up in her throat as she approached the lavender room. What she beheld there were heads, more orange heads, everywhere. Their eyes glowed, blood dripped from their fangs, and red lips formed a grin on their mouths. Goblins and ghouls were crowded around them, holding them, exchanging them. Frightful of being there any longer, she once again ran headlong into the rain. Her soaking feet took her right to the PRC department at Benson Cottage. This was her sixth mistake. Oh no, she thought. Here we go again. There were spiders everywhere and things hanging from the ceiling. More witches were screaming, and what was that? She couldn't believe her eyes. Someone was being beheaded. She couldn't take it any longer. She ran and ran until she came to a cave. Witches and goblins were all around her. She had no choice. She must go into the cave. Stumbling through, things grabbed her hair and touched her face. She knew she must get through this dark cavern and find a way to the outside. Finally, the end was in sight. She raced out of the building, across the campus, and to her car. She knew if she could get home, she would be safe from the witches, ghouls, and orange heads on this Halloween night. This was her seventh mistake. Beware, do not make the same 7 mistakes she did on Halloween. And then they list all 7 mistakes so the residents don't follow those same issues. So, number 1, do not shrug off rainy weather on Halloween. Number 2, visiting HD and other cottages and departments to see Halloween costumes. Number 3, going to the administration building and the Lee Breton to see the pumpkins decorated by Almsville Grade School and McKay High School. Number 4, going to O&M's Halloween Nightmare on Hoff. Number 5, going to Martin Cottage for the Pumpkin Pal Party. Number 6, going to PRC for the Physical Medicine Haunted House. Number 7, enjoying Halloween trick-or-treaters in your neighborhood.
So if I understand that correctly, they wrote a gruesome kids quote story to scare them away from doing those things because they didn't want them making those mistakes.
I really don't know. This is the first time I'm reading it. I just pulled it up and I was like, fuck yes, we have to put this in the podcast because Halloween horror stories, why not? And so it showed that they celebrated it there. They celebrated Halloween at Fairview.
Maybe a little bit. It does not sound much like a celebration, but...
It was written by the administration in the Breton College, and the editor was Cindy Forrest, and this was in 1994. This was published 1994.
Okay.
So this was after a lot of the bad
stuff was cleared out. Yeah, that's 6 years before it closed, so...
Yeah, I don't know. I just thought it was interesting. I wanted to share, so that was one part of Fairview that I thought was just kind of gave a little more of an inside light of what was happening there. And that
just goes back to like the staff cares. Like they didn't have to do that, but they're trying to make it a little less Fairview.
So
yeah, I like it.
That is that. That's our episode tonight, y'all. We have a second part to this with Debbie's interview, who was just phenomenal resource to talk to.
So you'll learn about her. She's got a lot to talk about on the subject, and
her sister was interred at Fairview for quite some time. So
yeah,
we'll be talking about that. We'll be talking about her book, which is really good so far. I would strongly recommend you guys to check that out when you hear about it. For now, we're gonna go ahead and sign off, and we hope you guys have a great night. Is there anything else you need to add, Charlie?
No, just play some happy music or something. Don't go to bed on this note. Go watch 5 minutes of happy YouTube and then go to bed. Don't fall asleep to this.
My go-to is usually My Little Pony or that really kitschy pug show on Netflix.
Pug and Potato?
Chip and Potato. I don't know.
Chip and Potato, yeah.
I don't know. Anyway, guys, we hope you have a great night. We can't wait to get the second part of this out to you. And remember that we love you and that we're going to make it through this. All right. Have a great night.